Something has been growing in you during the worst of it. You couldn't feel it. You couldn't see any evidence of it. There were months, maybe years, where all you could register was the weight, the confusion, the relentless sense that you were falling behind, or falling apart, or both. And if someone had told you during those stretches that something valuable was taking shape underneath all that pain, you would have wanted to believe them, but you wouldn't have. Because nothing about it felt productive. Nothing about it felt like progress. It felt like waste, like lost time, like years you'd never get back. Jung would have understood that feeling. He spent decades sitting across from people who carried that exact heaviness, the conviction that their suffering had stolen something from them that could never be returned. But what he observed over the course of hundreds of patients, over thousands of hours of depth work, contradicted what those patients believed about their own lives. The people who had been through the longest, darkest, most destabilizing periods of suffering weren't behind. They were being prepared for a kind of life that people who'd never suffered simply couldn't access. And the preparation was happening underground, in the dark, where they couldn't watch it or measure it or feel reassured by its progress. Jung would have called this the night sea journey, a psychological passage through darkness that the conscious mind experiences as destruction, while the deeper psyche uses it as raw material for transformation. The ancient myths understood this. The hero descends into the underworld before returning with something the surface world desperately needs. But the descent feels like death while you're living it. There's no signpost that says, "You're being built right now." There's only the dark, and the pressure, and the disorienting sense that you've lost the plot of your own life. Today I'm going to show you what Jung actually discovered about why the hardest years function differently than you think they do. The specific psychological capacities that only form under sustained difficulty. Why the rewards that are coming will look nothing like what self-help culture promises, and what it means if you're reading this right now, still in the thick of it, still wondering whether any of this will ever amount to something. To understand what Jung saw, you have to abandon the way most people think about suffering. The common framework goes like this. Hard things happen. You endure them, then you recover and go back to normal. Suffering is a disruption. Healing is returning to baseline. The goal is to get back to who you were before everything went wrong. Jung rejected this framework entirely. He observed that the people who tried to return to who they were before their suffering always got stuck. They'd do everything right, therapy, practices, self-care, time, and still feel like something was fundamentally off, because they were trying to rebuild a version of themselves that no longer existed. The suffering had already changed the foundation. Trying to put the old structure back on a new foundation guaranteed that nothing would feel stable. What Jung found instead was that suffering, when it's real and sustained and deep enough, initiates a psychological process he called individuation. And individuation doesn't restore you. It reorganizes you at a level so fundamental that the person who emerges from the process bears only a passing resemblance to the person who entered it. The values change, the priorities shift, the things that used to matter stop mattering, and things that never registered before become the center of everything. This is why the hardest years feel so disorienting. You're not just in pain, you're in transition. And transitions, by definition, mean the old thing has ended and the new thing hasn't arrived yet. You're in between, suspended. And that suspension feels like nothing is happening when in reality, everything is happening. The soil is turning over. The old roots are dying so new ones can take hold. But from the surface, all you can see is bare ground. Jung noticed something specific about what happens psychologically during extended hardship. The conscious mind, the part of you that plans and manages and tries to control outcomes, gets exhausted. It runs out of strategies. Every plan fails. Every coping mechanism stops working. And at a certain point, the conscious mind essentially gives up. It surrenders, though rarely gracefully. Usually it surrenders through collapse, depression, burnout, the flat sense that nothing you do makes any difference. And here's what Jung found remarkable. That collapse is when the real work begins. Because when the conscious mind stops running the show, the deeper layers of the psyche finally get room to operate. Parts of you that have been suppressed for decades start surfacing. Truths you've been avoiding become unavoidable. The false self, the the persona you built to function in the world, starts cracking apart, and what's underneath begins pushing through. This is terrifying when you're living it, because the false self felt like you. The persona felt like your identity, and watching it disintegrate feels like watching yourself die. Jung was honest about this. He didn't romanticize the process. He acknowledged that genuine psychological transformation involves a kind of death, and the grief and terror that accompany it are real. You are losing something. You're losing the version of yourself that couldn't survive what you've been through, and that loss hurts, even when what's replacing it is more authentic, because familiarity feels like safety, even when it's killing you slowly. But what grows in the space left behind, this is what Jung spent his career documenting, and this is where the rewards begin, though they arrive in forms almost nobody anticipates. The first thing Jung observed was that extended suffering develops a capacity for psychological depth that comfortable lives simply never produce. People who've been through the hardest years develop an ability to sit with complexity, ambiguity, and emotional intensity that makes them extraordinarily capable in ways that don't show up on any resume or social media profile. They can hold space for difficult truths without flinching. They can sit with someone in genuine pain without rushing to fix it or fleeing from the discomfort. They've learned, through their own dark passage, that some things can't be fixed, they can only be lived through, and that knowledge makes them the rarest kind of person. Someone who can be present for reality as it actually is. Jung recognized this depth as one of the most valuable psychological qualities a person can possess. He saw it in his patients who'd come through extended crisis, a groundedness, a weight to their presence that had nothing to do with confidence in the conventional sense. They weren't performing stability. They'd been broken down to bedrock and rebuilt from there, and there's a quality to that kind of foundation that can't be faked or shortcuts. The second capacity Jung documented was radical discernment. When you've been through years of hardship, especially hardship involving other people's dishonesty, manipulation, or betrayal, your ability to read situations becomes almost uncanny. You develop a sensitivity to incongruence that functions like a sixth sense. You can walk into a room and know within minutes who's performing and who's genuine. You can listen to someone speak and feel the gap between their words and their actual intentions. This isn't paranoia, it's pattern recognition refined through pain. People who'd endured the hardest years had been forced, usually against their will, to learn exactly what dishonesty looks like, what manipulation feels like in its early stages, what the subtle precursors to betrayal actually are. They learned because they had to. Because not learning meant continuing to be destroyed by the same patterns. And once that learning took hold, it became permanent. The people who came through the hardest years possessed a quality of judgment that others found almost eerie, an ability to see through surfaces to what was actually happening underneath. This discernment extends beyond people. It applies to situations, opportunities, environments. Jung observed that his patients who'd been through extended difficulty developed an almost allergic reaction to anything inauthentic. They could sense when a job would be soul-crushing. They could feel when a social environment was toxic before any overt evidence appeared. They could recognize when a path, however attractive on the surface, led somewhere they'd already been and barely survived. This wasn't cynicism. It was intelligence earned at tremendous cost. The third capacity, and this one surprised Jung, was the development of genuine creative power. He found that the individuation process, with all its suffering and disorientation, produced a kind of psychological fertility that hadn't existed before. People who came through the hardest years discovered creative impulses they'd never experienced, or reconnected with creative capacities they'd abandoned decades earlier. They wrote, they built things, they developed visions for how they wanted to live that bore no resemblance to the life they'd been living before the collapse. Jung understood why this happened. The persona, the false self, is a conformity machine. It exists to make you acceptable, to ensure you fit in, to manage other people's perceptions of you. And maintaining that persona requires enormous psychological energy. Energy that, once the persona cracks apart, suddenly becomes available for other things. People who've been through the hardest years often describe a strange experience in the aftermath. The sensation of having access to parts of themselves they didn't know existed. Ideas that seem to come from somewhere deeper than their usual thinking. A clarity about what they want to create that feels almost foreign in its specificity. Jung would have said this creative energy was always there. It was just being consumed by the work of maintaining a self that wasn't real. The suffering broke the container, and what had been trapped inside finally began flowing. This is one of the rewards no one tells you about, that after the hardest years, something in you becomes creatively alive in a way it never was before. And the things you create from that place carry a quality of authenticity that people can feel, even if they can't name what makes it different. If you've been moving through something like this, if the weight of these years has you wondering whether anything meaningful is taking root underneath the pain, there are 24 reflection exercises in the guide we created called True Self-Discovery, built around Jung's own approach to making the unconscious conscious. It won't rush you through what you're going through. It meets you where you are. Click below to get True Self-Discovery, and let's keep going. The fourth reward Jung identified was one most people never see coming: the capacity for genuine solitude. Before the hardest years, most people can't actually be alone. They can be physically alone, in a room by themselves, living without a partner, but psychologically, they're still tethered to other people's opinions, expectations, and validation. They make decisions based on what others will think. They shape their lives around approval. They fill silence with noise because silence forces them to confront themselves. The hardest years burn this dependency out, slowly, painfully, and usually without the person realizing it's happening. When your world contracts, when relationships fail, when social circles dissolve, when the people you thought would stay through anything reveal that their presence was conditional, you're forced into a confrontation with yourself that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. And at first, it's unbearable. The loneliness feels like it will kill you. The silence screams. But something shifts. Jung observed it again and again. At a certain point in the individuation process, solitude stops being a punishment and starts becoming a resource. The person discovers that they can sit with themselves, that their own company, once terrifying, is actually sufficient, that the desperate need for external validation was a symptom of an incomplete self, and the suffering has, slowly, brutally, been filling in the missing pieces. This capacity for genuine solitude transforms everything that comes after. Relationships change fundamentally because you stop entering them from deficit. You're no longer looking for someone to complete you, or fill the emptiness, or distract you from the parts of yourself you can't face. You enter relationships from wholeness, imperfect, scarred wholeness, but wholeness nonetheless. And relationships entered from wholeness have a completely different texture than relationships entered from need. Jung considered this one of the most significant outcomes of the individuation process, and he saw it consistently in people who'd endured the hardest years and come through rather than around them. The fifth reward is perhaps the most unexpected of all: a fundamental reorganization of what matters. Before the hardest years, most people are running on borrowed values. They want what they were taught to want. Success looks like what their family or culture defined as success. Their goals are inherited. Their ambitions are reflexive. Their life structure is built on assumptions they've never examined. Sustained suffering strips all of that away. When you're in genuine crisis, when the structures of your life are collapsing and you're hanging on by your fingernails, the things that don't actually matter to you fall away with startling speed. You stop caring about the promotion when your mental health is disintegrating. You stop caring about appearances when you can barely get through the day. You stop caring about other people's timelines for your life when you're fighting just to stay intact. And when the dust settles, when you finally start to stabilize after the worst of it, you discover something disorienting. The things you lost interest in during the crisis don't come back. The ambitions that fell away stay fallen. The values that dissolved don't reconstitute. And in their place, you find a set of priorities that feel like they actually belong to you. Maybe for the first time ever. What matters now is quieter, less impressive by conventional standards, but so much more real that the contrast almost makes you laugh. You can't believe you spent years chasing things that had nothing to do with who you actually are. Jung called this the emergence of the authentic self from underneath the persona, and he observed that it almost always required suffering to catalyze. Comfortable lives rarely produce this reorganization because comfortable lives don't create enough pressure to crack the persona open. The hardest years do. They apply pressure so relentless and so sustained that the false structure eventually gives way, and what's been buried underneath finally reaches the surface. Now here's the part that's difficult to hear, and it's where Jung's framework diverges sharply from what most self-help and spiritual teaching will tell you. The rewards of the hardest years don't arrive on the schedule you want them to. They don't announce themselves clearly, and they often look at first like more loss rather than gain. When your values reorganize, you may lose people who were connected to the old values. When genuine discernment develops, you may walk away from situations that once felt essential. When creative power awakens, you may feel restless and dissatisfied with a life that used to seem adequate. When the capacity for solitude deepens, you may spend a period feeling more alone than ever, not because you're regressing, but because you now need something from connection that most available connections can't provide. The rewards of the hardest years are real, but they're rewards for a different kind of life than the one you were living before. They equip you for depth, authenticity, and meaning. They don't equip you for the surface game you were playing before everything fell apart. And that's why they feel confusing when they first arrive. You're receiving exactly what you need for the life that's coming, but you're still measuring against the life you left behind. Jung was insistent on this point. He told his patients that the individuation process creates a person who is, in many ways, incompatible with the life they were living before the process began. The old job may no longer fit. The old relationship dynamics may become intolerable. The old social performances may feel like wearing a costume several sizes too small. And this incompatibility isn't failure, it's evidence that the transformation actually worked. You've become someone who can't go back to what you outgrew. The only direction that makes sense now is forward, into a life that matches who you've become rather than who you used to pretend to be. This is the part where people get scared, because forward is unknown territory. The old life, painful as it was at least familiar. The new life, the one these capacities are preparing you for, has no blueprint. You're building it in real time, from materials that didn't exist in your psychological inventory before the hardest years forged them. And building something real from scratch, without a template, is one of the most frightening and exhilarating things a person can do. The people who navigated this transition most successfully were the ones who stopped looking backward. They stopped measuring their current life against their old expectations. They stopped comparing their timeline to other people's timelines. They stopped asking, "When will I get back to normal?" and started asking, "What is this new capacity making possible?" That shift in questioning changed everything, because the answers to the second question were always more interesting, more alive, and more genuinely hopeful than any answer the first question could produce. There's something else Jung noticed about people emerging from the hardest years, and it's worth sitting with. He found that they developed an almost paradoxical relationship with their own suffering. They didn't celebrate it. They didn't reframe it as a blessing. They didn't paste gratitude over genuine pain. But they recognized, often with a kind of quiet astonishment, that they wouldn't trade the capacities their suffering had produced. Given the choice between being the person they were before, comfortable but asleep, functional but hollow, successful by external measures but strangers to their own depths, and being the person they'd become through the worst of it, they chose what they'd become. Every time. This wasn't Stockholm Syndrome with their own pain. It was the honest recognition that the person who exists on the other side of sustained difficulty is simply more capable of living a meaningful life than the person who existed before it, more capable of real connection, more capable of honest self-assessment, more capable of sitting with uncertainty without being destroyed by it, more capable of knowing what they want and pursuing it without apology. Jung would have called this the treasure of the night sea journey, the thing the hero brings back from the underworld. And the treasure is always the same, a version of yourself that's been stripped of everything inessential, everything borrowed, everything false. What remains is dense and real and capable of sustaining a life that actually belongs to you. If you're still in the hardest years right now, I want to be honest with you about what Jung's work suggests. It doesn't suggest that you should try to hurry through this. It doesn't suggest that if you just think positively enough, the pain will transform into something beautiful on your preferred timeline. It doesn't suggest that there's a technique or a practice that will shortcut the process. What it suggests is that you're in a passage, a genuine psychological passage, and that passages have their own timing. Seeds don't grow faster because you're anxious about the harvest. The process happening in you right now is operating on a timeline that your conscious mind doesn't control and can't accelerate. What you can do, and what Jung believed made the critical difference, is stay conscious through it. Keep paying attention to what's surfacing. Keep noticing what's falling away and what's trying to emerge. Don't numb yourself back to sleep just because being awake during this process is painful. The awareness you maintain now becomes the foundation of everything that follows. Jung also believed that the people in the hardest years needed to resist, with everything they had, the temptation to compare their insides to other people's outsides. Everyone around you may appear to be doing fine. Their lives may look intact. Their social media may project stability and success. And you may look at your own demolished landscape and conclude that something is uniquely wrong with you, that you failed where others have succeeded, that you're broken in ways other people aren't. Jung saw through this completely. He knew that the people who appeared most intact were often the most defended, the most committed to maintaining a persona at the expense of their actual psychological development. Their comfort wasn't evidence of health. It was, in many cases, evidence that they'd successfully avoided the very confrontation that would have made them whole. Your suffering isn't proof that you're failing. In Jung's framework, it may be proof that your psyche is refusing to let you sleepwalk through your own life anymore. That something in you has decided that authenticity matters more than comfort, even though authenticity requires passing through fire. The hardest years are about to reward you, and the rewards will look like this. You'll wake up one day and realize you trust your own judgment in a way you never did before. You'll notice that you're no longer willing to tolerate relationships that require you to perform a version of yourself that doesn't exist. You'll find that you have energy for things that genuinely matter to you, and no energy at all for the things that used to consume you through obligation. You'll recognize that you can sit in silence, alone, and feel something you barely have language for, the sense that you're finally, actually, inhabiting your own life. These rewards won't arrive all at once. They'll surface gradually, the way things grow after a long winter, slowly at first, then seemingly all at once. And you'll look back at the hardest years with something more complex than gratitude, more honest than appreciation. You'll look back and understand that the person standing here now, imperfect and scarred, and more awake than they've ever been, could only have been built in exactly the conditions you survived. Jung spent his entire career watching this process unfold in human lives, and he never stopped being moved by it. The people who went through the most came out with the most. The people whose lives were most thoroughly dismantled built the most authentic structures in the aftermath. The people who lost everything that wasn't real were the ones who finally found what was. Your hardest years aren't behind you as waste. They're beneath you as foundation. And what's about to be built on that foundation is something the person you were before the suffering could never have imagined, because that person didn't have the depth, the discernment, the creative power, or the self-knowledge to imagine it. You do now. You earned it the hardest possible way, and it's yours. If you haven't found it yet, we put together a guide called True Self-Discovery, 24 Jungian reflection exercises designed to help you actually hear what's been growing in the silence. It's for the version of you that's ready to stop surviving and start building. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.